So we wanted to do a little talk about securing Solr. I want to just kind of get an idea. How many people in here have worked with Solr security before? Okay, not very many. How many people in here are familiar with the authorization and authentication APIs in Solr and the security JSON? About the same number there. Okay. All right, so we'll just walk through this. Here's our basic agenda. We're just going to give you a little bit of the backstory here. Solr uses a plugin-based authentication. We're going to authentication and authorization. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about those two A's, about creating an effective permissions matrix, some do's and don'ts, and some troubleshooting, and then we'll open it up for questions. So basically, as of the 5.2 release, Solr started including authentication. As I said, it's a plugin-based. You have the rule-based authorization plugin and the basic auth plugin, but there are other plugins you can use, and you can write your own if you want to. To use Solr security, you have to initialize it. So out of the box, Solr is completely unsecured. You have to initialize it through the command line using the Zookeeper command line utility and uploading a security JSON file to your security instance to Zookeeper. It pushes out the security to your cluster, and then so your security is enabled. As I said, you can do this from the command line, or Steve and myself have written a little open source app we call the Auth Manager here, which lets you actually manage this stuff in a user interface. This is a GitHub project. It's open source. You can download it and use it. It just makes it easier to work with this stuff. So one of the curious things about the way Solr security is set up, you have, as I mentioned, the Zookeeper command line utility, but then you also have two APIs, authorization and authentication APIs. And I'll come back to that here. It's what we call the two A's. So once you upload your security JSON file and you've enabled security, you start to interact with that file and with the system through these two APIs. Authentication concerns the credentials, the users. Authorization concerns the permissions that those users and roles have to interact with the system. And just let me take a moment here to do a shameless plug for Fusion. So Solr does offer security, but Fusion's security implementation is much more granular, really much more robust, much easier to use. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of there. So there's our plug for Fusion. As I said, there are two ways you can manage your security JSON file. Manually, in other words, you can edit the JSON manually yourself, or you can use the Solr Security Manager, the Solr Auth Manager, which will take care of it for you. Like I say, the weird thing about this is once you enable security and then you start interacting with it with the authorization and authentication APIs, if for some reason you do something wrong with the APIs, let's say you create a permission that locks you out of the system, okay? The only way to get back in there is to use the Zookeeper command line utility and re-upload your security JSON. The problem is that's going to be the original file you uploaded. You don't actually have access to that security JSON file, right? So when you upload it again, any work that you had done with your authentication and authorization APIs is going to be overwritten. You'll basically start over. And that's kind of another area where the Solr Auth Manager is helpful because it allows you to create versions of security JSONs, to push a version. If you were to lock yourself out, like in the instance I just mentioned, you would actually be able to just roll it back, but you would always be, the Solr Auth Manager always maintains a full security JSON file for you, right? So you don't have to worry about losing that stuff. I'm going to turn it over briefly here to Steve. He's going to talk about basic auth and Kerberos.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm just going to briefly talk about the first A in our example or our presentation here, and that's really the authorization. It is pluggable. You could theoretically create any authorization mechanism that you wanted, but out of the box you get two from Lucidworks and Solr. And that is basic authentication, which is a HTTP authentication protocol that is really common and has been there since the web basically evolved. And then another one is Kerberos, which would be more of a system authorization or authentication mechanism that would be managed by your environment. How many people in here are lucky enough to have a Kerberos or that type of environment? So just a few of you, and there is the Kerberos plugin does work and it works well, so you shouldn't have any issues with that. That's it, Kevin.
So in the case that you wanted to write your own, and this is actually undocumented, so it's the reason I know there's a lot of text on this screen here, but I'm speaking to engineers, I imagine, so this is important. If you're going to write your own authorization plugin, you need to implement these interfaces, right? The authorization plugin, config editable plugin, spec provider. If you want to create your own authentication plugin, you need to extend this base class and implement these two interfaces. So what you would do is you download the Solr base, plug that into your project, and you would have access to these classes. You could extend it, compile it, put it in the lib, and then you could reference it in the security JSON file up there at the top. Oops. Whoa. Sorry. Okay. Laser. Right there at the class. And you just reference the class that you created right there in the class. And the same for authentication. And then you would be using your own class there. Authorization roles. Roles provide the context in which a user may interact with the system. In the case of Solr, this can be limiting overall access, limiting access to specific collections, limiting access to HTTP protocols, e.g. get, post, put, delete, limiting access to paths, e.g. select. Permissions are essentially the endpoint. User role permission. So the permission is the final evaluation there. Users bind to roles. So when you create a permission, you're not applying it to a user, you're applying it to the role. There is a one-to-one relationship between a role and a permission. And by that, I mean, if I create two roles, role 1, role 2, and then I go and I assign a read, the built-in read role to role 1 and role 2, the authorization API will gladly accept that. However, in the code, if you look, when it's evaluating permissions, the first one it comes to that matches is the one it uses, and it breaks right there and goes on. So it'll never evaluate that second permission. So you want to be really careful about assigning like multiple permissions like that. Okay. Some tips for creating an effective permissions matrix. Use only the most minimal amount of permissions, and by that I mean don't go hog wild, but at the same time you've got there's sort of a sweet spot, right? You don't want to create a huge permissions matrix, but you want to create enough that it covers everything that you're going to do, all your users and things like that. So I'm just saying put a lot of thought into your permissions. Don't, it's like I say, it's not as simple, and I'll come to an example here. It's not as simple as just read, and we'll get to an example about that here in a second. Permissions are about the role, not the user. As I said, do not duplicate permissions. Be careful with the all permission. An anatomy of permissions. These are the attributes The collection would be the name of a collection. The role, the defined role. The params, like I say, e.g., and foo equals var, the key value pairs in a query string, right? The path, e.g., select, update, any path. Method, the protocols used. You should note that get, put, post, delete, head are the ones that you want to use. Options, patch, things like that won't be accepted, okay? So you're limited to these protocols. Index is the name of the permission, is the index of the permission once it's been registered in the system. It's an integer. The documentation says when you're deleting a permission, you should delete it by the name. Actually, you should delete it by the integer. And then you actually have to re-index them to make sure that your index is not stale. This is kind of one of the other things the Solr Auth Manager will do for you. Before just specifies that this permission will be applied before the reference permission. Does that make sense to everybody? These are the predefined permissions. You can define your own, but these are the ones that are built into the system. Pretty straightforward. Collection, core, config, schema, metrics, and all. Okay, so this is an example of a real-world read permission. As I said, you see up the top there, I just defined read. Well, if I had done that, then people are going to be able to get into the app, but they're not going to be able to access all the features of the Solr admin console. To do that, you need to have these following permissions, right? I need to give them permission to read the schema, the config, the collection admin, metrics, and core. And that's the minimums for a full non-erroring read of your Solr admin dashboard. The same kind of goes with, we had another ticket come in with a client trying to set this up for a banana, and they had just referenced the pipeline, the banana pipeline in their permissions, and they're saying, well, it doesn't load. So, I looked at it, and it turns out, well, we had to add some pipelines in there. We had to add the fields. We had to add signals. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, you have to consider all the paths. And a good way to do that is if you set up a permission and it's not working the way you want it to work, go into Chrome, open up your developer tools, and look at the paths in the network console, right? Look what paths are being called, and then match those against your permission that you think ought to be being applied there, right? If you don't see those paths, then your thing isn't going to work. Excuse me, that simple. So troubleshooting permissions. Excuse me. No authorized user is a very common one. As you're going through, you can look through the Solr logs. The logging is not horribly precise, but it does give you a general idea of what's going on, right? No authorized user means, you're not logged in. Invalid role means even though you think you're applying this role, the system is saying, nope, I'm applying this role. So you have an invalid role. So you need to find the conflict in your permissions matrix there. This is probably going to be your most common exception when you're debugging permissions. That's a lot of text, I understand. and I'm going to put up a link to the blog that this came from at the end. But these are general tips and tricks when you're setting up Solr. Your Solr installation should always be behind a firewall. You should never expose it to the public, even if you have basic auth on there. It should really be behind a firewall. The user under which Solr is started should have write access to the Solr home directory by default. Permissions are first in, first out. I can go through all these, but should we go to questions? Any questions so far? Uh-huh. So you would assign it, you don't want to assign it to a user, you assign it to the role. So you create a user. Yep, let me go back to my example here. Pardon me while I hop back out here. So this is a sample security JSON file. Not the default, but this is one that I pulled a bunch of permissions out of till it would fit on the screen. But right there's our role-based plugin. So that's the class that's going to do the authentication, right? Or that's the one that's going to do authentication right there, basic auth. And that's the one that's going to handle our permissions up there. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Okay, fair enough. And I've been talking about basic auth, right? LDAP, Kerberos, SAML. Those are certainly doable, but you would have to basically write your own plugins for those. Fusion supports SAML, doesn't it? Yeah, Fusion supports SAML and LDAP. Solr does not at this point. Solr supports basic auth and Kerberos out of the box. You can write your own plugins to make just Solr support LDAP, but out of the box it does not. Does that answer your questions? Yep. Do you want to talk about LDAP for a sec? One of these guys? Like,
Yep. Yes. Yes.
yeah, your users in Kerberos, and check me if I'm wrong, your users in Kerberos have to match the users in Solr. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So you'd have to take your Kerberos configuration, port that over to a security JSON, then upload it, and then your Kerberos would be working.
And that security.json is what's going to activate the authentication.
Yes. Yep. And that's actually one of the a good use case for the Solr Auth Manager, quite honestly, because then you can bring it up and you just.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this would make it so you wouldn't, the problem with manual editing, right, is basically the, fat thumbs, typo, something like that, right? This would just make sure that when you're saving that security JSON file that it's valid JSON. Also, when you create a permission in Solr Auth Manager, it actually validates that permission against the permission class, right? So if you've created a permission that's not right, it won't let you save it, basically, right? And it actually, it won't let you create a permission that would violate the permissions architecture. So there's some advantages there too. Any other questions? Uh-huh.
I want to give permission for, two roles. One role can access only one type of document within the collection. Another role can access different type of document in the same collection. So can you do these kind of fine-grained control?
In theory, you can, yes. And again, I would say if you've got that sort of document level security requirements, you should consider Fusion, because it's going to do it for you out of the box. Okay. Solr can do that. If I were going to do that, I would use probably the path and the params attributes, right? So I'm going to look for the path, select, And then I'm going to look for query attributes that's going to bring back those documents. There isn't actually document level security, right? Yeah, query level, path, params, stuff like that, collection level. But for document level, you'd have to go to Fusion. Okay? Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
And are you going to give a demo of your thing?
We can.
Yeah, and real quick, one of the things that, why we did this is that it was so easy to actually screw up the security. And if you made a change, it took forever to figure out exactly where you went wrong and keep reapplying that. So we wanted to try to provide some interactivity to it. And when we did that, the easiest ways for us to do it was to, instead of create a command line operation and try to, do a whole bunch of crazy things with it, we created a graphical user interface using Java and Swing. With that, there's just a simple UI. But what happens is that for you to run it, you need to run it against your Solr that you're working with. So if you were going to try to tweak your production environment, you probably don't, your production environment is probably headless and has, no way to run the graphical tool. So we also are working and have it basically started and some of the features done where you can start the tool up as a web server. And it could run on your, whatever remote Solr environment you needed, and then you would interact with it through a web browser for that.
Keep talking.
Okay, keep talking. Go ahead.
Almost there. Hey.
Yeah. I'll have to look into that, but it could probably just be a documentation, a doc bug.
Okay, so this is Solr Auth Manager. As I said, it's basically just a tool to help you manage that security JSON file. There are some things that you'll notice. When you create a user, you upload the username and the password is then turned into a SHA-256 hash. It doesn't actually return that hash to you, so you never actually have it in hand. You actually have to call the Authorization API and dig it out of there. So one of the things that Solr Auth Manager does for you is to keep track of that. Lets you edit your users, change the passwords, things like that, add, delete. You can export your current config, which would be what you're looking at here, right? We have our, yeah, here. I'm screen sharing that over there. Here you go. Here you go. We see now? That's better. Okay. So you got your push config to Solr, save a version, view save versions. Which means I can go up and go, here's my save versions. So, I get a Solr, I get a security JSON, part of the way through, it's working. Okay, I got a baseline, I'm going to save that, and I'm going to keep working, right? Then if I run into a problem, I can always roll back to my earlier versions there. And Steve has taken upon himself to write a web interface for this. That's sort of currently under construction, but there's also a command line utility. So you got lots of ways you can use this, more than just a Swing interface. But really, the big screen here is the permissions. This is where you can create a permission. And like I say, if it'll do things like, it'll just give you warnings. Oh, gee, I've already got a read permission in there, so I don't want to do that. So do you want to do that? Yes, no. Things like that. And again, this is testing against the permissions class in Solr. But again, so in this case, if I were to somehow lock myself out, which actually when I was doing a demo for someone, I did. It makes it really easy because just go, okay, here's my base. I'm just going to push that one, and now we're all good again. So, you have any other questions? Anything? No? Yeah?
Do you want to elaborate on being careful with using all?
Sure. Bottom line is only admin should have or have all. I mean, there's really all in wildcard, you know. But if you, let's say I give my admin config edit, config read, you know, so I give them a few, but then I give this other user all, right? That other user actually has more permissions than the admin now, right? Does that make sense? So. Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. Admin all is fine. That's pretty much where it should only be given. So, anybody else? Yes, sir. So field level, again, you know, in theory you can do that with the paths and the params attributes in the permissions. But generally, when you need document or field level security, you're going to want to look to Fusion because that's going to do it for you without doing a whole bunch of extra development. So, any other questions? There must be some questions. You want to demo the web UI?
No, that's
Okay.
But if you do want to, if it is a tool that you use, it's a GitHub project, and if you want to get involved and leverage it, we would love to have help.
That would be wonderful. So I'm finishing up a little early here.
50 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
It's been a long conference, and so everybody learned a lot of things, and probably won't even remember this.
That-
Go ahead.
How does this compare to using like Apache Sentry or Apache Ranger as an auth mechanism?
I would say, and you know, in all fairness, I'm not super familiar with those, but I would say that you would use them in conjunction with. What do you think?
Implementing those probably does this behind the scenes for you.
It's
Actually, Cassandra would know on Ranger. Does it use any of the plugins? But or is it its own plugin? Solr 5.2 was before we had 0. So when we got to Solr 5.2 and any notion of authorization and authentication, that was in my opinion, was a huge step. And to really get sophisticated and do the right thing, you need something else potentially. And that's where Fusion, you know, other items are there for you. This is, in my opinion, just to helpfully create the secure Solr data store in the back end. It really isn't. Hopefully you're not managing hundreds of users and, you know, unless that's your architecture.
yeah, and that's again. If go ahead, sir.
No, that makes sense.
Cool.
So you mentioned that in several situations you suggested you should use Fusion instead because it has more granular permissions, authentication stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing that on our site, but I feel it seems like maybe there's also a vulnerability of someone going directly to Solr, deleting our aliases or deleting a collection. It doesn't seem that the protection in Fusion did anything to protect Solr itself.
Oh, exactly. They don't. They're two totally separate things. Fusion is is a proxy to Solr, and Solr is, you know, its own entity. So this type of security that we're suggesting would be in addition to your Fusion. You would lock up your Solr environment and then make sure that your Fusion environment can talk then to Solr.
So if we're using the Active Directory authentication in Fusion, that still doesn't help us any for Solr. We're still going to have to roll our own if we also want to keep people out.
Out of Solr. Yeah.
Or you know, as well as networking, you know, all kinds of things in the back end to make it so that anybody on your network can't get to the data part of your application.
Yeah, I would say that normally in a situation like
that, your Solr wouldn't be directly accessible to end users. They would be accessing it through Fusion. So you use a firewall and appropriate
Right.
tools to stop that from happening. If your Solr is exposed, then you'd have to go through and lock everything down as well.
And that's what we had to do before 5.2. If you wanted to secure it, you had to, put firewall rules in that only your app server could talk to your Solr server and stuff like that.
You could also do you have people accessing like the Solr admin console directly? Or is it all just through Fusion?
So it's security through obvious obscurity, yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
well, you could also, just whitelist only the IP from the Fusion box if they're on different boxes, or even localhost if they're on the same.
Yeah.
And that way nobody gets to it anyway. So
Yeah.
you've got some options there other than having to maintain two authentication schemes. But if you've got sensitive data, I think it's probably
Paranoia
wise.
is the better.
Anybody else? Now, what's that again? I'm sorry?
That would be in Fusion, part of the, really query pipeline type of ideas and security trimmings where you could add, what's that? Yes, yep, exactly. So that you could then, have your client on that pipeline, but then take the LDAP or the authentication information that you can get and use that to build other filter queries. People use that, create a stage, go query LDAP, go grab some groups, and then add that to the FQ for the query.
And one of the other things that we've got coming out in the future is the rules editor, which will be integrated with Fusion. Yep. And so we're working on permissions there. So you can create query pipelines that only certain users can access, things like that. So they could only have access effectively to those documents in the query pipelines, stuff like that.
Thanks to Eric Thatcher, of course.
Thanks to Eric Hatcher. Any other questions?
So everybody that didn't raise their hand is going to rush home and secure their Solr? Or they already have a solution, right?
And you totally understand everything there is to know about Solr security now? We've done that well?
No, just kidding. Oh, thanks, Clay.
Sir, do you have another question? Uh-huh. Okay. You're going to set up, it's actually through Solr, you can set up the configuration there for HTTPS.
And you're just using Solr or Fusion and Solr? Okay, okay.
Solr actually would push the configuration to Jetty when it's loaded.
Yeah, so you'd
context.
configure Jetty to run with SSL.
Yeah.
And in Fusion, they make it really easy. There's a properties file, and you can turn on a thing. And as long as your key store is set up right, then you should be secure for your SSL channel.
Anybody else?
Okay, thank you guys. Make
Thanks
sure you
very
fill
much.
out any questionnaires.